The beginning of the 3rd century marked a period in which the Christian communities of the Roman Empire, though minor in demographic terms, maintained discernible institutional structures and urban organization. In Carthage, Alexandria, Rome, and parts of Syria, Christian congregations operated under the governance of bishops, episcopoi, presbyters, elders, and deacons, with their functions attested through letters, inscriptions, and extant Latin and Greek writings. These officers oversaw the administration of liturgical practice, distribution of charity, and adjudication of internal disputes, forming a hierarchy recognizable in subsequent historical documentation. In Carthage, the year 203 AD is documented through the trial and execution of Perpetua and Felicity. The Passio Perpetui et Felicitatis, composed near the time of their martyrdom, provides a first-hand civic record of their arrest, trial before the Roman magistrate, and subsequent execution in the amphitheater. The text situates these events explicitly within the local administration, including the roles of procurators and magistrates, and preserves the recorded actions of named Christians. This document, while a narrative of martyrdom, functions as a contemporaneous legal and social record. It attests the procedures applied to Christians accused of contravening Roman religious obligations, specifically the refusal to offer sacrifices to the imperial cult. The document provides not only a record of execution, but also the structural presence of Christian leadership within Carthage at the time, including the coordination of prayer, catechesis, and community care preceding the arrests. Simultaneously, Tertullian of Carthage composed a significant portion of his Latin corpus between approximately 197 AD and 220 AD. His works, letters, apologetic tracts, and treatises on discipline document the development of Christian terminology, theology, and administrative norms in North Africa. In Ad Nations and Apologeticum, Tertullian records the legal pressures faced by Christians and the strategies employed for communal cohesion. De Praescriptione Hereticorum and De Corona exhibit an early codification of prescriptive norms regarding clerical conduct, penitential discipline, and public assembly. These writings confirm the presence of a formalized clerical structure and demonstrate the early articulation of concepts such as episcopal authority and the accountability of presbyters to their congregations. In Alexandria, inscriptions and fragments of early Greek Christian writings show a parallel structure. Episcopoi and presbyters are referenced in administrative correspondence and catechetical letters, though fewer complete texts survive from this precise period. The documented exchanges between local leaders and lay members, reconstructed from papyrus fragments, indicate practices of communal support, regulation of sacraments, and oversight of teaching. These surviving fragments, combined with Tertullian's North African records, established that Christian communities had moved beyond informal assemblies and were operating with identifiable internal governance by the early 3rd century. Rome, as the imperial capital, exhibits a slightly different record. Documentation includes references in Latin texts and inscriptions, the earliest of which demonstrate the presence of local episcopal oversight and deaconate organization. The apostolic tradition, while preserved in later manuscripts, contains early 3rd century strata that describe the functions of bishops, presbyters, and deacons, as well as the administration of baptism, Eucharist, and penitential rites. These elements align with the North African evidence, confirming that urban Christian congregations maintained comparable clerical structures, liturgical practices, and disciplinary procedures across multiple provinces. Legal fragments and Roman administrative records provide corroboration for these ecclesial structures. While imperial legislation concerning Christians in this period is sparse, surviving rescripts and citations in later compilations confirm the authorities' recognition of Christian leaders. Local magistrates occasionally recorded the names of accused or executed Christians, noting their offices within the community. These entries, though fragmentary, provide a secondary verification of the presence and function of bishops and presbyters in civic terms. Material culture further supports the documentary record. Funerary inscriptions in urban centers, such as those uncovered in Carthage, Rome, and Alexandria, indicate Christian burial practices and community organization. Inscriptions identify both the deceased and, in some cases, the overseeing clerics, providing physical evidence for the coordination of congregational care. Archaeological investigations of early house churches in urban areas reveal adaptations for assembly, with spatial divisions corresponding to the functions described in textual sources, spaces for instruction, prayer, and collection of alms. These architectural remnants, in combination with inscriptions and surviving literature, demonstrate the sustained presence of organized Christian communities with clear administrative hierarchies. The period also records the consolidation of theological vocabulary. Tertullian's writings in Latin, combined with Greek fragments from Alexandria, show a developing lexicon for discussing sin, salvation, sacrament, and ecclesiastical office. His treatises outline disciplinary measures for lapsi, those who renounced faith under threat, prescribe conduct for clergy, and provide instructions for lay participation. Letters and epistles surviving from the era, both addressed to local congregations and exchanged between bishops, reflect the practical application of these norms, including procedures for reading mission, charity distribution, and oversight of catechetical instruction. Persecution in this period, while not empire-wide or systematically recorded, is attested through specific civic events. The Carthaginian executions of 203 AD are the clearest example. Inscriptions and letters confirm that the authorities acted according to formal legal procedures rather than sporadic or arbitrary violence. In Rome, evidence for prosecutions comes from administrative entries and allusions in apologetic literature. These records indicate that while imperial enforcement varied, local magistrates recognized Christian leaders and could pursue legal action based on civic law, demonstrating the interaction between Christian administrative structures and Roman governance. The survival of episcopal correspondence from this era, though limited, demonstrates the establishment of networks for communication and governance across urban communities. Letters reveal exchanges on disciplinary cases, doctrinal clarification, and coordination of charitable activity. Such documentation shows that bishops were not isolated figures. They operated within regional hierarchies and were accountable to collective norms. The administrative and liturgical practices recorded in these letters align with contemporaneous inscriptions and legal fragments, forming a coherent picture of organizational maturity. The period from 222 to 235 AD in the history of the early Christian Church was characterized by relative stability within the urban communities of the Roman Empire, particularly under the Severan dynasty. Following the accession of Severus Alexander in 222 AD, Christian communities experienced a phase during which administrative structures and scholarly activity became increasingly visible. Documentation from Alexandria, Carthage, Rome, and selected provinces demonstrates the consolidation of episcopal authority, the refinement of clerical roles, and the codification of disciplinary procedures. These developments are attested through surviving correspondence, papyrus fragments, inscriptions, and literary works, most notably the corpus of Origen in Alexandria and the continued writings of Tertullian in North Africa. In Alexandria, the intellectual center of the Eastern Mediterranean, Origen of Alexandria produced works that reflect a systematic engagement with scripture, textual criticism, and catechesis. His Contra Celsum, on first principles, Peri-Archon, and exegetically commentaries on Hebrew and Greek scriptures provide a verifiable record of Christian intellectual activity in the early 3rd century. Origen's writings, preserved in quotations, later manuscripts, and fragments, demonstrate the application of Hellenistic philological methods to the interpretation of Christian texts, including critical attention to variant readings and the relationship between Old and New Testament scriptures. Surviving letters attributed to Origen, though transmitted via later sources, establish networks of scholarly correspondence wherein he addressed questions of liturgical practice, hermeneutics, and catechetical instruction. The extant evidence documents the organized scholarly efforts undertaken within Alexandria, including the supervision of teachers and students within catechetical schools, confirming that Christian education had acquired formalized structures. Simultaneously, North African communities maintained a robust administrative and disciplinary framework. Tertullian's later treatises, particularly De Pudicitia, De Baptismo, and De Exhortation Castitatis, provide insight into the normative expectations for both clergy and laity. He codified practices for the administration of baptism, delineated the roles of bishops, presbyters, and deacons, and outlined procedures for maintaining communal discipline. Letters from bishops, surviving in part through later compilations, corroborate the existence of synodal communication between urban centers, demonstrating that disciplinary disputes and doctrinal questions were mediated through formal networks. The evidence indicates that these communities operated with a combination of episcopal oversight and localized presbyterial councils, as seen in procedural references to the adjudication of lapsi, disputes over sacramental administration, and oversight of catechetical instruction. In Rome and other Western provinces, fragments of liturgical instruction, most prominently the apostolic tradition, preserve early 3rd century strata documenting the roles of bishops, presbyters, and deacons. The text details the procedures for ordination, the administration of baptism and Eucharist, and the governance of penitential practice. While later manuscript transmission complicates precise dating, internal evidence aligns these instructions with practices attested in contemporary Latin correspondence and inscriptions, demonstrating an early uniformity in clerical roles and responsibilities. Inscriptions in Rome referencing deacons and presbyters confirm their active participation in charitable distribution and the oversight of domestic assembly spaces adapted for liturgical gatherings. The combination of textual and epigraphic evidence establishes that Roman communities maintained functioning hierarchical and administrative systems, comparable to those documented in North Africa and Alexandria. The consolidation of episcopal authority during this period is further evidenced by surviving correspondence among bishops. Letters from Carthage, preserved in part through later collections, describe synodal deliberations, disciplinary procedures, and coordination of charitable activity. These letters show bishops intervening in local disputes, standardizing penance procedures, and overseeing clerical appointments, indicating the growing capacity of episcopal networks to enforce normative practice across multiple communities. Surviving papyri from Egypt, though fragmentary, contain procedural instructions and attest to the administration of Christian charitable funds, suggesting that episcopal oversight extended beyond ritual into social governance, including the maintenance of cemeterial grounds and support for impoverished members of the congregation. Persecution during this interval remained sporadic and localized, with evidence indicating that imperial policies under Severus Alexander were less systematically directed at Christians than in previous decades. Roman legal documents, inscriptions noting trials, and references in contemporary apologetic literature suggest that while Christians continued to face legal pressure, enforcement varied across urban centers. Arrests and prosecutions appear to have been managed at the provincial level, often reflecting local magistrates' priorities rather than imperial edicts. In this context, episcopal correspondence and the writings of Tertullian provide insight into the community's strategies for maintaining internal cohesion, administering sacraments, and responding to legal threats. These records do not speculate on communal motives, but record administrative actions and normative procedures. Alexandrian catechetical schools, under the supervision of figures such as Origen, exemplify the combination of intellectual and institutional consolidation. Surviving references indicate structured curricula for the instruction of catechumens, the training of readers, and the preparation of new converts for baptism. Origen's letters discuss practical matters such as scheduling, curriculum content, and the qualifications of teachers. The preservation of these documents, in combination with later citations by Eusebius and Jerome, confirms the existence of organized educational structures integrated into the ecclesiastical hierarchy. These programs facilitated uniformity of teaching, scriptural literacy, and doctrinal consistency, reinforcing episcopal authority across Alexandria and, by extension, other communities influenced by Alexandrian scholarship. Liturgical standardization also emerges as a feature of the period. Both in Rome and North Africa, correspondence and fragmentary manuscripts describe procedures for the Eucharist, baptism, and penitential rites. Surviving texts outline the proper administration of these rites, the sequence of prayers, and the roles of specific clerical offices. Inscriptions corroborate the functional division of responsibilities, noting presbyters in charge of catechesis and deacons administering charitable distributions. The convergence of textual, epigraphic, and papyrological evidence establishes that these practices were operational and recognized by both ecclesial and civic authorities, illustrating a measurable consistency across regions. Regional variation is apparent, but the evidence demonstrates comparable administrative structures in multiple urban centers. In Syria and the Levant, surviving letters and inscriptions confirm the presence of bishops with delegated presbyters and deacons, and the coordination of charitable and liturgical duties. Archaeological remains of domestic assembly spaces in Antioch, along with epigraphic markers of Christian donors and clerics, support the textual record. These findings establish that by the mid-3rd century, urban Christian communities were functioning within a recognizable administrative framework, equipped to manage liturgical practice, social welfare, and intercongregational communication. The period also documents the continued development of theological terminology. Origen's exegetically work in Greek and Tertullian's Latin treatises provide contemporaneous sources illustrating the articulation of doctrinal concepts, including sin, redemption, sacrament, and ecclesial office. Surviving correspondence reflects the practical application of this vocabulary in disciplinary contexts, catechesis, and pastoral instruction. No evidence exists in these texts for speculation regarding communal psychology. Rather, they systematically record administrative action, theological exposition, and normative procedure. The historian can therefore reconstruct the development of a functional theological lexicon directly tied to the operations of Christian communities during this period. The economic and social organization of congregations is further documented through inscriptions, papyri, and letters. References to charitable distributions, maintenance of burial grounds, and the allocation of resources for catechetical instruction indicate that bishops and presbyters exercised administrative authority over both ritual and material dimensions of communal life. Evidence from Carthage and Rome demonstrates the formalization of collection systems, the appointment of clerical officers to oversee funds, and procedural oversight for resource distribution. These practices reflect coordinated administrative effort rather than informal or ad hoc action, consistent across multiple urban centers. Communication networks between communities emerge from the surviving correspondence of bishops and scholarly figures. Letters document procedural coordination, doctrinal clarification, and synodal decisions, showing that Christian leadership operated within interconnected regional hierarchies. These networks facilitated the standardization of liturgical practice, catechetical instruction, and disciplinary measures. Surviving synodal letters and papyrus fragments confirm the practical mechanisms of oversight, establishing the Church as a coordinated institution operating across geographical boundaries. The accession of Maximinus Thrax in 235 AD marked the beginning of a period of imperial instability that significantly affected the Roman Empire and, by extension, the early Christian communities across urban centers. The rapid succession of emperors over the following decades introduced inconsistencies in provincial governance, taxation, and legal enforcement, producing uneven conditions for Christian populations. Documentation from letters, inscriptions, funerary monuments, and fragmentary papyri provides insight into how these communities maintained structural coherence and administrative functions during a period of political turbulence. In Rome, administrative records and inscriptions confirm that Christian leadership remained active despite irregular imperial oversight. Bishops presided over presbyters and deacons, coordinating the conduct of liturgy, charitable distribution, and maintenance of burial grounds. The apostolic tradition, preserved in later manuscripts but reflecting early 3rd century strata, describes the sequence of liturgical acts, the ordination of clergy, and the distribution of charitable resources. Inscriptions in the city reference the dedication of tombs and memorials by named presbyters, confirming the continued operation of hierarchical offices. These material and textual records illustrate that even in the absence of systematic imperial support, Christian communities preserve their internal organization and urban presence. In Carthage, the epistolary records of bishops demonstrate sustained administration and coordination. Letters preserved from synodal deliberations detail procedures for reconciling disciplinary cases, managing resources, and standardizing liturgical practice. References to charitable funds, catechetical instruction, and clerical oversight indicate that bishops maintained operational authority despite external pressures. Archival fragments, combined with archaeological evidence of domestic assembly spaces adapted for communal worship, confirm the presence of functioning urban Christian institutions. Funerary inscriptions identify both clergy and lay participants, illustrating the integration of religious administration with daily civic life. The eastern provinces, particularly Alexandria and parts of Syria, reveal continuity of intellectual and administrative practice under variable imperial oversight. Surviving correspondence and fragmentary papyri document the operation of catechetical schools, the supervision of clerical personnel, and the management of charitable funds. Origen's exegetically work, though composed slightly earlier, continued to circulate and influence clerical instruction. References in later compilations of his letters suggest that bishops coordinated teaching, ordination, and discipline even in regions experiencing political disruption. Archaeological evidence from Antioch and surrounding urban centers corroborates textual records, including the adaptation of domestic spaces for liturgical assembly, the use of burial grounds managed under episcopal authority, and the allocation of resources for catechetical purposes. Imperial instability affected Christian communities unevenly. Documentation indicates that the frequency and severity of coercion depended on local governors, enforcement policies, and the presence of provincial military units. Inscriptions and trial records reference individual Christians subject to civic pressure, including the payment of fines, forced labor, or brief imprisonment. These records, however, do not suggest systematic empire-wide persecution during the interval. Surviving episcopal correspondence, including letters later preserved by Cyprian of Carthage, details procedural responses to such pressures, documenting pastoral oversight, record-keeping, and coordination of support for affected members. The historian notes that these responses are documented administratively rather than psychologically. Letters describe actions and decisions rather than communal sentiment. The material record from urban centers illustrates adaptive continuity in Christian practice. Burial inscriptions in Rome, Carthage, and Alexandria preserve the names of clergy, sponsors, and deceased laity, indicating that Christian funerary customs were maintained under variable political conditions. The structure of inscriptions consistently identifies bishops and presbyters, underscoring the operational continuity of hierarchical offices. Domestic assembly spaces adapted for worship, discovered archaeologically in North Africa and the Levant, provide physical evidence of organized liturgical practice. These spaces, often converted from residential units, were structured with designated areas for teaching, prayer, and the collection of alms. The convergence of archaeological and textual evidence confirms that administrative and liturgical systems remained intact despite the instability of imperial authority. Records of resource management during this period further illustrate structural resilience. Papyri from Egypt and inscriptions from Carthage detail the allocation of charitable funds for the maintenance of the poor, support for widows and orphans, and upkeep of burial grounds. Bishops and presbyters are explicitly named as administrators in these documents, confirming their oversight of both spiritual and material affairs. Such documentation demonstrates a sophisticated organizational capacity, enabling communities to function effectively despite intermittent political disruption. Episcopal correspondence also reflects the continued standardization of liturgical and disciplinary norms. Letters from Carthage and Rome outline procedures for ordination, catechetical instruction, and penitential practice. Synodal letters, some preserved in part through later compilations, record adjudication of disputes over clerical conduct, sacramental administration, and disciplinary measures for laity. These documents indicate that bishops communicated procedural standards across regional networks, reinforcing organizational cohesion in multiple urban centers. The record shows that episcopal authority operated within an established administrative framework rather than through ad hoc or personal initiative. Documentation from inscriptions and letters highlights the continuity of theological terminology during this period. Texts preserved in Alexandria, Carthage, and Rome demonstrate consistent usage of terms related to clerical office, sacrament, and communal discipline. Origen's exegetically commentary, together with Tertullian's Latin treatises, provided authoritative reference points for clerical instruction and disciplinary codification. Surviving letters describe procedural applications of these terms in ordination, catechesis, and penance. The historian can therefore reconstruct an internally consistent theological lexicon applied to operational practices without recourse to speculation or later interpretive overlays. The period also records selective incidents of coercion, documented through legal and administrative fragments. Roman trial records, magistrates' entries, and epigraphic references note individual Christians prosecuted for refusal to participate in civic cult practices, payment of taxes, or other obligations framed under Roman law. These entries often include the names and roles of clergy or prominent laity, confirming the persistence of organizational hierarchy. Letters preserved from episcopal networks describe procedural responses, including documentation of compliance, provision of guidance for those under scrutiny, and coordination of support for families affected by prosecutions. The historian can rely on these sources to establish the administrative continuity of the Church amid intermittent external pressure. Economic and logistical coordination is evident across multiple urban centers. Documents reference charitable disbursements, burial ground maintenance, and allocation of liturgical materials. Presbyters and deacons manage these operations under episcopal supervision, providing evidence of a functioning bureaucracy within the Christian community. The consistent identification of clerical office holders in inscriptions and papyri corroborates literary accounts, forming a unified record of institutional resilience. Assemblies for worship and catechetical instruction continued to operate in purpose-adapted domestic spaces, illustrating the practical implementation of administrative and liturgical directives in the urban environment. Letters and correspondence indicate inter-regional coordination and administrative oversight. Surviving papyri and epistolary fragments document communication between bishops regarding disciplinary procedures, liturgical practice, and financial management. These networks facilitated the standardization of operations, demonstrating that episcopal governance was systemic rather than localized. Synodal deliberations, reflected in these letters, preserved procedural uniformity, confirmed clerical status, and coordinated responses to external pressures. The historian observes that the evidence documents administrative mechanisms rather than communal sentiment or psychological states. By 249 AD, Christian communities had maintained operational continuity despite the turbulence of imperial succession and local enforcement variability. Bishops presided over presbyters and deacons, coordinating liturgy, discipline, and charitable activity. Urban centers such as Rome, Carthage, Alexandria, and Antioch displayed evidence of functioning administrative networks, structured catechetical instruction, and standardized sacramental practice. Funerary inscriptions, domestic assembly archaeology, and surviving papyri converge with literary sources to form a coherent record of institutional resilience. Episodic persecution was documented through civic procedures and addressed through established clerical mechanisms, further confirming the existence of sustained hierarchical governance. In 249 AD, Emperor Decius issued a rescript mandating that all inhabitants of the Roman Empire perform public sacrifices to the gods and the well-being of the emperor, thereby formalizing a legal mechanism for asserting imperial religious conformity. Surviving papyri, including administrative fragments from Egypt and references preserved in later compilations, confirmed that the rescript required certification of compliance in the form of libelli or official documents verifying that an individual had performed the prescribed sacrifice. These certificates were issued through local magistrates and attest to the bureaucratic enforcement of the imperial edict. The documentation demonstrates that the mandate applied universally across urban centers and provinces, affecting Christians alongside other citizens, and was administered through formal civic procedures. The Decian Mandate represents the first systematically documented, empire-wide measure requiring participation in civic religious rites, distinguished from previous sporadic persecutions by its legal framing. Administrative papyri from Egypt preserve examples of libelli, some completed and signed by local magistrates, confirming procedural uniformity. These records indicate that Christians were compelled to choose between civic compliance and adherence to their own religious norms. The issuance of libelli provides a direct documentary basis for understanding the scope of the crisis, specifying the mechanics of enforcement without resorting to anecdotal accounts. Documentation of the Church's response to the Decian Mandate is preserved primarily through episcopal correspondence and later compilations of letters written in this period. Surviving letters from Carthage, Rome, and Asia Minor describe procedures for addressing the lapsi, Christians who obtained certificates or otherwise complied with the imperial requirement. These letters contain explicit instructions regarding penance, readmission to communion, and maintenance of clerical office. Synodal decisions, referenced in preserved correspondence, demonstrate an organized, systematic response to the challenge posed by the mandate, emphasizing administrative and procedural resolution rather than speculative interpretation of motives. In Rome, the episcopal administration coordinated a consistent approach to cases of compliance and refusal. Letters from the period, preserved in part through later ecclesiastical collections, document procedures for adjudicating lapsi, distinguishing between those who voluntarily performed sacrifices and those compelled under duress. These records provide a verifiable procedural account of clerical oversight, detailing requirements for penance, conditions for reintegration into liturgical participation, and maintenance of the authority of bishops and presbyters. The letters reference specific individuals, clerical officers, and community assemblies, confirming that procedural mechanisms were enacted at both local and regional levels. In Carthage, documentation preserved in the letters of Cyprian provides one of the clearest windows into administrative practice during the Decian crisis. Cyprian's correspondence includes synodal letters and directives addressing the restoration of lapsi, the maintenance of episcopal authority, and coordination with neighboring communities. Surviving letters specify conditions for readmission, procedures for public penance, and the adjudication of clerical status, illustrating a carefully codified framework of governance in response to the imperial mandate. These letters reflect administrative action rather than narrative embellishment, providing a contemporary record of the Church's institutional capacity to respond to external coercion. The material record complements the textual evidence. Funerary inscriptions from urban centers in North Africa and the eastern provinces reference individuals who maintained clerical or lay status during the Decian Mandate, indicating continuity of office and communal recognition despite external pressures. Inscriptions identify bishops and presbyters as signatories or administrators of communal obligations, suggesting that hierarchical governance persisted. Archaeological evidence, including the continued use of domestic assembly spaces for liturgical practice, demonstrates that Christian worship remained operational under the constraints imposed by the legal requirement of sacrifice. The convergence of documentary, epigraphic, and architectural evidence confirms that Christian communities maintained organizational cohesion while responding to an unprecedented legal challenge. The issuance of libelli produced a measurable category of Christians whose compliance or noncompliance was documented administratively. Papyri from Egypt record certificates for named individuals, including attestations signed by local magistrates. These documents provide exacting detail regarding the procedural mechanism by which the mandate was enforced. Correspondence from bishops indicates that communities cataloged and monitored compliance, establishing processes for record-keeping, pastoral oversight, and disciplinary adjudication. These procedures were applied consistently across urban centers and provincial jurisdictions, reflecting the administrative capacity of the Church to respond systematically to a legal crisis. The Decian edict also resulted in the delineation of ecclesiastical jurisdiction concerning penance and readmission. Episcopal correspondence specifies the authority of bishops to evaluate cases, impose sanctions, and reinstate members to full participation in liturgical rites. Synodal letters preserved from the period document collective decision-making processes, demonstrating that governance was exercised through formal assemblies and codified procedures. These letters emphasize the procedural and juridical aspects of administration rather than moral or psychological interpretation. Roman administrative records provide additional context for the enforcement of the Decian Mandate. Surviving rescripts and papyri indicate that magistrates maintained registries of compliance, supervised sacrifices, and issued certificates without discretionary interference. These documents confirm that enforcement was conducted through formal civic mechanisms, which were documented in writing and preserved in archives. The historian can thus reconstruct the interaction between civic authority and Christian communities with precision, relying solely on recorded evidence. Inscriptions and epigraphic evidence further corroborate the administrative response to the Decian crisis. Epitaphs and dedicatory inscriptions identify clergy and lay participants in urban communities, sometimes noting their roles or status within the Church before, during, or after the enforcement period. These inscriptions provide independent confirmation of episcopal oversight, continuity of office, and procedural administration. They demonstrate that organizational structures remained intact, allowing the Church to implement consistent disciplinary measures despite the external imposition of the mandate. The procedural documentation of penance during this interval reveals the Church's capacity to adjudicate cases without relying on anecdotal or legendary accounts. Letters specify graded measures of penance based on documented compliance, duration of lapses, and clerical status. Correspondence preserved in later compilations references specific cases, demonstrating that bishops applied standardized criteria in response to the recorded behavior of members. These letters form the primary documentary basis for understanding the administrative and juridical processes applied during the Decian Mandate, without invoking narrative interpretation or conjecture. Economic and logistical administration also continued under the Decian Mandate. Papyri and inscriptions record the continued allocation of charitable funds, maintenance of burial grounds, and provision for catechetical instruction. Bishops and presbyters are explicitly identified as administrators of these resources, indicating that functional governance persisted even amid the enforcement of the rescript. Documentation demonstrates that operational activities, including the distribution of aid, management of resources, and oversight of clerical personnel, remained consistent across urban centers, confirming the resilience of institutional structures. By 251 AD, following the death of Decius in battle and the cessation of imperial enforcement, Christian communities began to address the recorded outcomes of the mandate systematically. Episcopal letters, synodal correspondence, and administrative documents from Carthage, Rome, and Alexandria describe the reconciliation of lapsi, standardization of disciplinary measures, and preservation of hierarchical authority. Material evidence, including inscriptions and domestic assembly adaptations, confirms continuity in liturgical practice, clerical office, and resource management. The historian can verify, without extrapolation or speculation, that the Church emerged from the Decian crisis as an administratively coherent and institutionally resilient organization. The death of Emperor Decius in 251 AD concluded the period of legally mandated sacrifice and opened the early Christian Church to a phase of internal administrative challenge and reorganization. The Decian edict had produced a defined category of lapsi, those Christians who had obtained certificates, libelli, or otherwise complied with imperial sacrificial requirements. In the aftermath, urban Christian communities across the empire engaged in procedural measures to restore order, regulate penance, and maintain episcopal authority. Surviving letters, synodal acts, inscriptions, and fragmentary papyri provide the primary documentary basis for understanding this period, with no reliance on legend or conjecture. In Rome, the emergence of the Novatian movement exemplifies the schismatic responses to the lapsi issue. Novatian, a presbyter of Roman origin, produced a rigorous position documented through surviving letters and later ecclesiastical compilations rooted in contemporary sources. His advocacy for the permanent exclusion of the lapsi from communion was systematically applied in the Roman context and documented through correspondence with other clerics and synodal participants. Inscriptions and administrative records from Roman Christian communities confirm the parallel operation of Novatianist assemblies alongside those adhering to the episcopal seat, demonstrating the structural reality of schism without recourse to narrative embellishment. The Novatian movement, while doctrinally and disciplinarily distinct, remained identifiable within the documented administrative landscape of the city. Concurrently, in Carthage, Cyprian, bishop of the local community, exercised procedural oversight of lapsi and coordinated synodal responses to disciplinary questions. His extant letters, preserved in near-contemporary compilations, outline synodal decisions, clerical adjudications, and pastoral instructions. These documents provide explicit guidance for penance, readmission to communion, and the maintenance of clerical office. Cyprian's correspondence documents the processes by which bishops collectively determined disciplinary standards, including the application of graded penance based on documented lapses, clerical status, and compliance history. These letters form a verifiable record of structured governance and codified disciplinary procedure. Regional synods during this interval played a critical role in institutional stabilization. Surviving synodal letters and epistolary fragments describe procedures for coordinating responses to lapsi, standardizing disciplinary measures, and resolving clerical disputes. In North Africa, synodal correspondence between Carthaginian bishops and neighboring sees indicates an organized network capable of implementing procedural uniformity across multiple urban centers. The letters contain detailed instructions for the assessment of individual cases, adjudication by episcopal panels, and reintegration into communal worship. Archaeological evidence, including inscriptions and dedication markers, confirms that these administrative measures were operationally enforced and recognized within the community. Episcopal correspondence further documents practical administration in the management of clerical personnel. Letters from Carthage, Rome, and Asia Minor describe procedures for ordination, reassignment, and oversight of presbyters and deacons. Clerics who had lapsed during the Decian crisis were subject to adjudication under codified rules, including public or private penance, probationary oversight, and conditions for restoration to office. Documentation specifies the authority of bishops to evaluate compliance, maintain records, and enforce ecclesiastical norms. These procedures, preserved in contemporary letters and later compilations, provide a verifiable record of systematic governance rather than anecdotal reporting. The Novatianist schism in Rome illustrates the operational complexity of post-Decian administration. Inscriptions and letters from Roman Christian communities indicate the coexistence of parallel assemblies, each maintaining hierarchical structures, liturgical practice, and administrative oversight. Documentation specifies that Novatianist assemblies retained presbyters and deacons in offices mirroring those of the episcopal seat, providing functional evidence of organized schismatic governance. These records confirm the existence of divergent disciplinary systems, while simultaneously demonstrating the capacity of urban communities to sustain clerical oversight and liturgical continuity. In North Africa, Cyprian's letters describe synodal adjudication of disputed clerical appointments, disciplinary infractions, and sacramental administration. The correspondence documents procedural responses to lapsi, including evaluation of prior compliance, penance assignments, and conditions for readmission to both laity and clergy. These letters are preserved in near-contemporary compilations and demonstrate consistent administrative application across multiple sees. Epigraphic evidence corroborates the maintenance of episcopal authority, showing the continued recognition of bishops, presbyters, and deacons in formal inscriptions and funerary markers. Documentation of charitable administration during this interval demonstrates continuity of operational governance. Papyri and inscriptions record the management of funds for widows, orphans, and impoverished community members. Bishops and presbyters are identified as administrators of these resources, confirming the structured oversight of both ritual and material affairs. Allocation of funds, maintenance of burial grounds, and support for catechetical instruction proceeded alongside disciplinary administration. indicating the simultaneous functioning of multiple bureaucratic and pastoral operations within urban communities. Archaeological evidence further reinforces the continuity of administrative and liturgical organization. Domestic assembly spaces in North Africa, Rome, and parts of Syria continue to serve as centers for worship, instruction, and charitable distribution. Structural adaptations, including defined areas for teaching, prayer, and collection of funds, demonstrate operational conformity with documented procedures. Funerary inscriptions identify clerics responsible for oversight of burial rites, reinforcing the correspondence between textual instruction and material practice. The historian can reconstruct the operational framework of these communities without recourse to narrative embellishment. Interregional correspondence preserves the coordination of episcopal authority and procedural standardization. Letters describe adjudication of lapsi cases, ordination of presbyters and deacons, and synodal communication across provincial boundaries. These networks facilitated the dissemination of standardized disciplinary measures, ensuring consistency in liturgical and administrative practice across urban centers. Surviving records illustrate the functional application of hierarchical governance, demonstrating that bishops acted within codified procedural parameters rather than on personal discretion alone. Documentation from this period also confirms the development and application of theological terminology in administrative practice. Cyprian's letters, Tertullian's earlier works, and surviving papyri preserve precise vocabulary for clerical office, sacrament, and disciplinary procedure. The use of standardized terms in letters and synodal documentation reflects the codification of operational norms. These sources allow the historian to reconstruct the governance and disciplinary mechanisms of early 3rd century Christian communities without interpretive speculation. By 257 AD, Christian communities had completed significant reorganization in the wake of the Decian crisis. Bishops maintained authoritative oversight of presbyters and deacons, administered disciplinary procedures, coordinated charitable distribution, and ensured continuity of liturgical practice. Schismatic movements such as Novatianism operated with parallel governance structures, documented in inscriptions and correspondence, reflecting the coexistence of doctrinally divergent yet administratively functional communities. Epigraphic, archaeological, and papyrological evidence collectively confirms operational continuity in urban Christian centers, demonstrating the resilience and procedural sophistication of the Church in addressing internal challenges. The historian can conclude that the interval from 251 to 257 AD represents a phase of procedural consolidation and administrative stabilization. Surviving letters, synodal correspondence, inscriptions, and papyri provide consistent, verifiable evidence of operational oversight, disciplinary adjudication, and clerical management. The post-Decian period exhibits measurable organizational coherence, with bishops coordinating across urban centers, presbyters executing delegated duties, and deacons administering material and charitable responsibilities. These practices were implemented systematically, confirmed by documentary evidence, and sustained across multiple provinces. The interval between 257 and 260 AD in the early Christian Church is marked by targeted imperial measures under Emperor Valerian and the administrative repercussions for urban communities. Surviving correspondence, papyri, inscriptions, and legal fragments document the enforcement of imperial policy against Christian clergy, detailing both executions and the broader regulatory framework. These sources provide the historian with a verifiable record of events without recourse to legend or interpretive narrative. Valerian issued rescripts beginning in 257 AD that distinguished between the treatment of ordinary Christians and the clergy, emphasizing the removal of episcopal and presbyterial leadership. Surviving legal fragments reference the prohibition of clerical office holders from public assembly and the imposition of a capital penalty for noncompliance. Papyri from Egypt confirm administrative procedures for the enforcement of rescripts, demonstrating formal communication between provincial governors and local magistrates tasked with ensuring compliance. The documentation indicates that enforcement was systematic, applied through civic structures, and specifically targeted leadership positions within Christian communities. Cyprian of Carthage, bishop of one of the largest North African sees, becomes a central figure in the documentary record of this period. His correspondence, preserved in part through near-contemporary collections, details procedural preparation, pastoral guidance, and formal communication with local and regional clergy in anticipation of and during enforcement actions. Letters document instructions for the administration of penance, maintenance of clerical hierarchy, and the continuity of liturgical practice amid the threat of persecution. The historian can trace through these records the structured implementation of episcopal authority in conditions of political hazard. The arrest and execution of Cyprian, conventionally dated to 258 AD, are corroborated by multiple independent documentary sources. Letters and procedural notes preserved in Carthaginian archives, alongside references in later compilations grounded in these near-contemporary documents, confirm both the timing and method of execution. Inscriptions and epigraphic records reference his episcopal status and posthumous recognition by the local community, providing material confirmation of his leadership and the administrative impact of his removal. These sources collectively provide a clear, verifiable account of the event within the civic and ecclesiastical framework of North Africa. In Rome and other Western provinces, papyri and inscriptions demonstrate that presbyters and deacons were subjected to similar regulatory measures, albeit with variation in enforcement intensity. Legal records from municipal archives reference the detention and punishment of named clergy, confirming the systematic targeting of Christian leadership. Letters from bishops detail procedural responses, including coordination of liturgical continuity, supervision of catechetical instruction, and maintenance of charitable operations. Documentation indicates that administrative mechanisms were enacted to ensure operational resilience despite external coercion. Material evidence complements the textual record. Inscriptions in urban centers across North Africa, Syria, and Egypt identify clerical office holders and confirm continued hierarchical oversight following executions and detentions. Epigraphic evidence confirms the existence of functioning presbyterial and diaconal offices, the supervision of charitable funds, and the administration of burial grounds. Domestic assembly spaces adapted for liturgical use continued to operate under episcopal oversight, demonstrating the persistence of organizational structures despite direct imperial pressure. Documentation also highlights the differentiation between clerical and lay treatment under Valerian's policy. Letters preserved from Carthaginian and Roman bishops describe procedural measures for lay communities, including the continuation of Eucharistic celebration, catechetical instruction, and charitable distribution, even when episcopal leadership was compromised. Papyri and fragmentary letters confirm that presbyters and deacons assumed temporary administrative responsibilities in coordination with surviving episcopal networks, illustrating the operational capacity of the church to function amid targeted suppression. Correspondence and synodal letters further illuminate administrative continuity. Episcopal networks coordinated responses to detentions and executions, ensuring that liturgical practices, disciplinary measures, and resource management remained intact. These documents specify procedural measures for ordination, supervision, and documentation of compliance or abstention from imperial requirements. Synodal communication confirms that bishops and presbyters exercise structured oversight, maintaining organizational coherence even in the absence of primary episcopal leadership. Economic and logistical administration continued under these conditions, as demonstrated by papyri and inscriptions documenting resource allocation. Charitable funds for widows, orphans, and impoverished members were overseen by presbyters and deacons under codified procedures, verified by episcopal correspondence. Maintenance of burial grounds, provision for catechetical instruction, and distribution of material support proceeded according to established administrative protocols, illustrating the capacity of urban communities to sustain operations in conditions of coercion. The policy shift following Valerian's capture by the Sassanid forces in 260 AD produced a documented relaxation of imperial measures. Letters and papyri from Egypt and North Africa referenced the cessation of enforcement, restitution of clerical property, and renewed operational freedom for bishops and presbyters. Surviving correspondence describes the reintegration of previously detained clergy, restoration of liturgical authority, and the reestablishment of administrative networks. Inscriptions confirm the reappointment and recognition of bishops in urban centers, demonstrating formal restoration of hierarchical governance. Archaeological evidence aligns with textual sources, confirming operational continuity and post-persecution recovery. Domestic assembly spaces continued to serve as centers for liturgy, catechetical instruction, and charitable distribution. Funerary inscriptions identify clergy and community leaders active before and after enforcement measures, providing material continuity with documented procedural practices. These findings corroborate the textual record of administrative resilience and formal restoration of church operations following political reversal. The administration of disciplinary procedures during targeted persecution is documented exclusively through letters, synodal records, and papyri. Episcopal correspondence specifies protocols for clerical accountability, penance, and resource allocation. Surviving records indicate that bishops exercised authority through codified mechanisms, with procedural oversight extending to presbyters, deacons, and, in some cases, laity. This documentation confirms the systematic application of governance principles without reliance on legend, anecdote, or interpretive speculation. Documentation from this period also confirms the use of standardized theological and administrative terminology in both disciplinary and operational contexts. Cyprian's letters, preserved near contemporaneously, include consistent language describing clerical office, sacrament, and procedural administration. Papyri and inscriptions employ comparable terminology in reference to episcopal authority, charitable oversight, and liturgical administration. The uniformity of vocabulary across regions indicates the codification of operational norms within the administrative structure of the Church. By 260 AD, The combination of targeted persecution, execution of key leaders, and subsequent policy reversal demonstrates the resilience and organizational sophistication of early Christian communities. Episcopal correspondence, legal fragments, papyri, and inscriptions collectively confirm continuity in hierarchical oversight, liturgical practice, and administrative coordination. Christian communities maintained presbyters and deacons in operational offices, coordinated interregional networks, and preserved charitable and educational programs, ensuring the sustained functionality of urban congregations. Following the cessation of targeted persecution in the early 260s, Christian communities across the Roman Empire entered a period of structural consolidation and institutional maturation. Surviving letters, papyri, inscriptions, and administrative fragments from North Africa, Rome, Egypt, and the eastern provinces provide a coherent record of episcopal coordination, clerical administration, liturgical organization, and urban expansion. These sources collectively demonstrate the development of formalized procedures for governance, resource management, and interregional correspondence, illustrating the Church's transition into a systematically organized institution. In North Africa, the episcopal network centered in Carthage provides one of the most complete documentary windows into church operations. Letters preserved from Cyprian's episcopate and those of his successors document coordinated synodal procedures for adjudicating disciplinary cases, ordaining presbyters and deacons, and maintaining liturgical standards. These letters indicate that bishops exercised authority over multiple urban and rural communities, supervising the administration of charitable funds, burial grounds, and catechetical instruction. Inscriptions corroborate these textual records, identifying individual bishops, presbyters, and deacons, and confirming the formal recognition of hierarchical office within civic structures. The consolidation of episcopal governance extended to Rome, where surviving papyri, inscriptions, and synodal letters demonstrate the establishment of administrative continuity. Clerical offices, including presbyters and deacons, were maintained with clearly defined responsibilities for liturgy, catechesis, and resource distribution. Inscriptions commemorate the dedication of burial spaces and charitable endowments under episcopal oversight, providing material confirmation of operational administration. Letters indicate that procedures for ordination, disciplinary adjudication, and liturgical practice were codified and applied systematically, reinforcing hierarchical authority and promoting cohesion across multiple urban assemblies. In Egypt, surviving papyri provide evidence for detailed administrative record-keeping, particularly in Alexandria and surrounding provinces. Documents include registers of charitable distributions, instructions for the maintenance of clerical and communal property, and the coordination of liturgical assemblies. Episcopal correspondence confirms the supervision of presbyters and deacons in domestic assembly spaces adapted for worship, teaching, and resource management. The papyri also document interregional communication with Carthaginian and Roman bishops, reflecting a standardized approach to governance that integrated disciplinary, liturgical, and financial administration. The eastern provinces, including Antioch and regions of Syria, similarly display institutional continuity. Inscriptions and letters document episcopal oversight of catechetical schools, coordination of sacramental instruction, and administration of charitable resources. Archaeological evidence, including the adaptation of domestic spaces for liturgical assembly and the maintenance of burial grounds, complements the textual record. Presbyters and deacons are consistently identified as operational administrators, confirming the continuity of hierarchical and procedural authority across multiple cities. These sources collectively indicate that episcopal networks functioned as cohesive, structured institutions even in regions geographically distant from Rome or Carthage. Charitable administration provides a particularly robust lens for understanding institutional consolidation. Papyri and inscriptions record funds allocated for widows, orphans, and impoverished members of the Christian community. Clerics, operating under episcopal authority, administered these resources through codified procedures. Documentation specifies the oversight of burial grounds, distribution of material assistance, and maintenance of liturgical assemblies. Letters and synodal records indicate that these administrative operations were coordinated regionally, ensuring consistent application of procedural norms and operational standards across urban and provincial communities. Episcopal correspondence also demonstrates the establishment of interregional communication networks. Surviving letters describe the coordination of disciplinary adjudication, ordination procedures, and the management of charitable and liturgical operations across multiple sees. Synodal deliberations documented in these letters provide procedural confirmation of decisions regarding clerical status, liturgical conformity, and restoration of members following lapses. The historian can trace the formal integration of local, regional, and interprovincial governance structures through these documented networks, revealing the systematic nature of church administration in the late 3rd century. Inscriptions across multiple provinces reinforce the textual evidence for hierarchical organization. Funerary markers and dedication inscriptions identify bishops, presbyters, and deacons, often specifying their operational roles in liturgy, teaching, and charitable oversight. The continued use of domestic assembly spaces for worship, verified through architectural studies and material remains, demonstrates the practical implementation of episcopal directives. These inscriptions confirm that clerical office holders exercised authority in both ritual and administrative domains, sustaining organizational cohesion even in urban environments subject to civic variability. Documentation also indicates the formalization of liturgical and catechetical procedures. Letters from Carthage, Rome, and Alexandria describe standardized sequences for baptism, Eucharistic celebration, and ordination. Synodal records and papyri specify responsibilities of presbyters and deacons in facilitating instruction, administering sacraments, and supervising communal worship. Archaeological evidence corroborates the textual record, with designated spaces for teaching, prayer, and alms collection identifiable in domestic assembly adaptations. These findings indicate the operational maturity of the Church, with codified processes applied consistently across diverse geographic regions. Regional differentiation emerges as a documented feature of late 3rd century church organization. In North Africa, Carthaginian bishops coordinated closely with subordinate urban and rural communities, applying disciplinary and liturgical standards with synodal oversight. In Rome, presbyters and deacons maintained operational governance under episcopal supervision, accommodating local urban structures. In Egypt and the eastern provinces, episcopal correspondence documents regional variations in administrative emphasis, reflecting adaptation to local social and civic conditions while maintaining doctrinal and procedural consistency. Inscriptions and papyri confirm these regional adaptations, demonstrating the flexibility of hierarchical structures in responding to contextual conditions without compromising standardized governance. The period also reflects institutional resilience in the face of intermittent political instability. Surviving letters, papyri, and inscriptions demonstrate that urban communities maintained hierarchical oversight, coordinated charitable and liturgical operations, and documented clerical administration even when civil authority was inconsistent or locally variable. The historian can trace the continuous functioning of episcopal networks, presbyterial and diaconal administration, and urban organizational structures without recourse to speculative reconstruction. Execution, detention, or coercion of individual clerics, when recorded, was addressed administratively, ensuring continuity of governance. By the close of the 3rd century, the early church had established a mature organizational framework characterized by codified hierarchical authority, operationally distinct clerical offices, standardized liturgical and catechetical procedures, regionally coordinated synodal networks, and administratively supervised charitable operations. Inscriptions, papyri, and letters collectively provide evidence for sustained urban operations, interregional coordination, and procedural standardization. Domestic assembly spaces, burial grounds, and resource allocations were consistently managed under episcopal oversight, confirming the operational coherence of Christian communities across multiple provinces. The historian observes that the Church's development from 260 to 299 AD reflects deliberate procedural consolidation rather than narrative or interpretive speculation. Surviving documentation demonstrates the systematic management of liturgy, discipline, clerical administration, and material resources. Epistolary networks, synodal records, and inscriptions confirm continuity of hierarchical governance, interregional coordination, and operational oversight. Archaeological and epigraphic evidence verifies the practical implementation of these administrative structures in urban centers. By 299 AD, the early church had developed into a resilient, organized institution prepared to navigate both internal governance and external pressures. Episcopal networks coordinated discipline, liturgy, and resource management across urban centers. Presbyters and deacons executed delegated responsibilities under codified procedures. Regional differentiation allowed adaptation to local social, civic, and political conditions while preserving doctrinal and administrative consistency. Inscriptions, papyri, and letters collectively verify the structure, functions, and interconnections of the Church as a mature organization.